Good morning. Good morning. I know it's been a few days since I've been able to get on and speak on the word. It's honestly been under the weather for the last few days, and so I haven't been getting up as early. So I've just kind of been having some personal time with the Lord, but haven't had time to do this or haven't made time. I've also just been kind of meditating on these next passages that I'm going to take a look at today. We're going to take a look at two sections about the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through 28, and then Mark chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. And this finishes out what I consider to be the ESV Study Bible considers to be kind of a section where Jesus deals with, I think it's 5 different confrontations or conflicts. The first is when he heals the paralytic, and the issue is over, does he have authority to be able to forgive sins? So that was what the conflict was. Then the next one is when he calls Matthew or Levi, and they say, they ask his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And one of the things that was pointed out as I was looking at some of the commentaries is that those who are coming and asking questions often ask questions about his disciples to Jesus, or they ask questions about Jesus to his disciples. I don't know if I just said the same thing, but it's almost like the enemy tries to put a wedge between Jesus and his disciples. They'll come to his disciples and say, what's with your master? Or they'll come to Jesus and say, what's with your disciples? The third is the question about fasting. When people come and they say, hey, John's disciple, and this time they come to Jesus about his disciples. Hey, John's disciples and the Pharisees are fasting, but why aren't your disciples fasting? Then that was the last one we looked at. So that's the first 3. And then we've got two conflicts about the Sabbath that we're going to see here. So starting in verse 23 of Matthew chapter 2. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So two situations where Jesus is confronted. The first, he's confronted about his disciples. The second, he is confronted by having a situation. And really, they both come down to priorities. Priorities and motive and emphasis. The Sabbath is a day of rest, instituted by God for the rest of his people, for the rest of the servants, the animals. Everything was to rest and to enjoy rest on the Sabbath. And so as Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man. It was made to be a blessing, also a blessing spiritually, a day of worship, being able to enjoy and rest in God. We see in Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4, it says, we enter into rest through faith. Once we come to faith in Jesus Christ, we understand that we're saved, we're made right with God, not because of our good deeds, but because of what Jesus has done. We receive it by faith. We receive righteousness. And so that is our ultimate rest. So rest, Sabbath is about rest. So let's just start at the beginning. What was the issue? So the disciples were plucking heads of grain from the field, which they were allowed to do. The law allowed, not to reap from somebody else's field, but if you were hungry and you were going through the grain field, you could just pluck heads of grain. But according to the Pharisees' understanding, this was work. This was reaping. And notice Jesus doesn't say, no, this isn't work. He doesn't debate with their interpretation of what work is. But he takes them to a passage in the Old Testament where David and his companions were hungry. So that's the issue here is there is a need that they're meeting, and they're just doing it on the Sabbath day. So they're not trying to go about working. They're just trying to meet a need that they have. And so Jesus is helping them to see that there is I hate to use the word hierarchy, but there's kind of a ranking, or there's weightier matters. Let me use Jesus' words. In Matthew chapter 23, he confronts the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leadership, and he says, you hypocrites, you tithe of your mint and dill and cumin, you tithe of your herbs, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, mercy and justice. And so Jesus is saying that he's not saying it's just disregard the Sabbath, because that was a law, and Jesus isn't going to break the law. He is going to perfectly obey his Father's law. But he's saying that ultimately the Sabbath was made for man, and they are meeting this need, and that's consistent with what we see in the Old Testament, is that even though it would have been unlawful for them to eat the bread of the presence, that they were allowed to eat it because it was meeting a particular need. So where they weren't trying to go about breaking the law, but it was meeting a need. And then he says this amazing thing. He says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus, being the Lord of the Sabbath, is able to help his disciples to keep the Sabbath in an honoring way, but also to know when they are keeping it and when they're not. But even more significantly than that, it's right before that, it says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And I've thought about this. It's like, so if the Sabbath is made for man, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, there's like this middle connecting statement that Jesus is Lord of man, which Son of Man hints to. Son of Man is Jesus' title for himself, but it goes back to this passage in Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man, my throat is still a little bit hoarse. It goes back to the statement where there's one like a Son of Man who comes on the clouds and receives an everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days. So Jesus is the Lord of man, is really what he's claiming there. And he's the Lord of the Sabbath, who knows how to keep it. He doesn't need the Pharisees to come to him and tell him how to keep the Sabbath. Again, he enters the synagogue. Then you have this really pitiful situation where you have a man who has a withered hand. I don't know exactly what that would have looked like, but he's got an unusable hand. And generally agrarian culture, where to not have use of one hand would be a significant imposition. I mean, it would be an imposition today, but when you have to be working in fields and such, that would be a big imposition in your ability to function. And notice what it says. It says they were watching Jesus, whether he would heal, so that for the purpose that they might accuse him. So they weren't coming. They just had finished in the last story casting doubt on the disciples in terms of what they were doing, but then they're coming in with a totally wrong heart attitude, with a heart attitude of wanting to accuse Jesus. And so he's going to confront their heart attitude. He's going to confront the heart issue here by doing this very out in front. And so he tells the man to come here. And it's going to require some, as one of my friends pointed out when we looked at this story a little bit ago, it's going to require some faith from that man, because now he's going to be at the center of this controversy. But he's got to determine that, to obey Jesus and to be healed is higher order. To have faith and come to Jesus is a more important thing than fear of what those who are watching Jesus and watching him might do if he complies. Because in another story, the people actually get angry at the man who wants to be healed. They say, hey, there's 6 days to be healed. Come be healed on one of those days, but not on the Sabbath. So Jesus poses this question. He says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. You just think about this, because that's what their heart attitude is, to do harm. They want to do harm against Jesus. We see that right after it says, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against Jesus, how to destroy him. So they are the ones who want to kill and harm on the Sabbath. And the obvious answer to Jesus' question is it's lawful to do good and save life on the Sabbath, not to kill and steal, or not to kill and destroy. And yet it says they immediately held counsel. So they're going, assuming this is the same day, which it seems, they're willing to try and go make plans to kill on the Sabbath, but they are holding it against Jesus because he wants to heal on the Sabbath. So just to finish that story, so Jesus is grieved at their hardness of heart, and he says to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. So we see that Jesus is, he's getting to the heart of the issue, and that the issue is the heart in this story. And the problem with these men is that their heart was wrong. Their heart was not right with God. But rather than repenting at his question, his kind of gentle rebuke, if you will, at this point gentle, they were entrenched further into darkness and hardness of heart. And they settled to try and actually kill Jesus. So coming back to chapter 2, verse 28, the Son of Man, Jesus, is Lord of the Sabbath. This passage is part of the first half of Gospel of Mark, which I haven't really talked too much to this point, but the first half is really answering the question, who is Jesus? Who is the person of Christ? And then we're going to see what he came to do, especially focused on in the second half, the plan of Christ. So the person of Christ in the first half of Mark, the plan of Christ in the second half. But that's not like hard and fast. There's obviously things that are about the person of Christ in the second half, and there's things that show us the plan of Christ in the first half. But we are going to see a pivot point in Mark chapter 8. But Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord. It says in Romans chapter 10, if we confess with our mouths that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, we will be saved. Jesus is Lord. That's what he is showing through these different stories. He's Lord. And the proper attitude towards him, as he gives at the very beginning, when he very first begins to preach, is to repent and believe. So these people were standing against him, and anyone who stands against him and does not submit to him today is doing so at the peril of their soul, for he is the Lord. So may the Lord give us grace to further submit to him, to love him, to rejoice in him, and to rest in faith in him even today. God bless.